Hi, my name is Pete Scazzero. I want to welcome you today to the Emotionally Healthy Leader podcast. Great to be with you. I'm so excited about our theme for today, which is the great leadership shift the world is waiting for. The great leader shift the world is waiting for. So most of us, we lead from the outside in, not the inside out. Yet the world is waiting for men and women, leaders who actually lead from a deep inside out life in God out into the world. Now, many of us, like myself, my formation, our discipleship, our leadership formation was primarily external. It was outside. So we learned a lot of competencies. So I attended, for example, countless conferences and trainings and seminaries over decades, doing advanced training in a variety of topics and learning how to teach and how to preach and how to be a communicator that is able to create an engaging presentation to captivate people. They want to bring their friends to it the following week. I learned how to read scripture and how to study it and how to exegete it in the original languages. And I learned history and theology and how to build teams and leadership and how to build a healthy culture and cast a vision and mobilize people to use their gifts. And I learned some excellent models of leadership from secular places and how to do strategic planning, how to seize new opportunities. Then I learned how to welcome visitors and how to welcome seekers and guests coming into our community, how to prioritize the next generation. I learned about that, how to build a great children's and youth and young adult ministry, and that was relevant to the culture and the challenges people were facing. I learned how to design age-appropriate, safe, hospitable spaces in our building for people to come into for the first time and meet God. I learned to recruit volunteers and train volunteers and in such a way that they would want to stay and keep volunteering. I learned to create healthy on-ramps for people to come into our church and connect and build community. I learned how to build digital platforms because the church is not just now physical, it's digital, and how to create engaging digital platforms for people to come into our community and grow, and how to connect people, how to disciple people, and how to build great small groups and train leaders. And there was just so much, how to create great worship experiences with music and a good atmosphere on Sunday celebration to lift people to God. And I was always so impressed with anointings and giftings and charisma that I would see in different leaders. And so it's good, it's healthy to grow in external competencies. The problem is the weight we give them over and against the inner life. Now, we do some work, of course, on the inner life, but it's the proportion. Way more than we can even imagine is given to the external tasks and learnings and competencies of leadership that is actually giving to the inner life. That's why I'm calling this podcast The Great Leader Shift. The world is waiting for it, not just the world. Your family's waiting for it. Your friends are waiting for it. Your ministry is waiting for it. Your church is waiting for it. It's what the world needs. And so, again, we so badly want to grow our ministries and see them prosper, and that's not a bad thing. So I remember my early years, I'd spend a good 15, 20 hours on an average sermon or message I was going to deliver, and I would be looking for great illustrations and a way to keep people's attention. And towards the end, which was generally late Saturday night or early Sunday morning, I'd really focus on, okay, how's this thing really impacting me? Personal application. But the majority of my even message time was about the text and connecting it to people, but it wasn't passing deeply through my inner life. There was a season and a time in our church when we were lead pastors that Jerry was in charge, my wife, in charge of celebration. Jerry's very gifted, very creative. And I remember she did it for a few years, and she was creating what one person said was incredible halftime shows between worship and the sermon. And she was so good at it, she caught herself of that. She was putting so much energy and effort into making a fantastic Sunday experience for people that it was all external. And so she pulled out of it and realized, no, I'm putting too much weight in this. I've got to put weight on people's inner life and discipling and mentoring leaders, et cetera. And I remember it was just she just fell into it because it was so popular and the church was just growing so fast. And so, but the problem is when we keep the external ministry first or external life first and focused on that, we have, as a result, in our churches, we've got a lot of ongoing scandals of leaders, just goes on generation after generation. We've got a lot of superficiality and shallowness of people in our churches in terms of their transformation is minimal. Our impact in the world is minimal in the culture. Leaders get tired. We get tired because we're carrying people because we've got to carry them. They don't have enough God in them to want the zeal to basically like serve and cast vision themselves and receive dreams and visions from God. And it just, the fruit in our churches that we're experiencing is not long-term sustainable over generations. It's generally short-term. And because we've got us as leaders who are not necessarily teaching and leading with the authority and the power that we see, for example, in the ministry of Jesus. I mean, one of the marks of Jesus in Mark 1, for example, it speaks about when Jesus begins to teach and preach, they say, who is this who teaches with such authority? It was different. There was something distinct about Jesus. And it was coming from a deep place of inner authority in God. But again, we're in the 21st century in the Western church. And what's interesting is, yes, it's a focus that we experience in Western culture around the world, but it was actually is in the first century as well, because Jesus is constantly battling with the religious leaders of his day, saying, hey, you clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you're full of dead person's bones. And you're focused so much on external purity, but not the internal depth and holiness. And that's why Jesus taught with such authority. And so to me, a tremendous story which illustrates this is Acts chapter 19, when the story is told of the 7 sons of Sceva. These 7 sons of Sceva they'd seen the extraordinary power flowing from Paul, miracles, and people who just touched his handkerchief were getting healed. It was just tremendous power flowing, and they wanted it to have that extraordinary power flow through them. And so they longed for that kind of success, but they didn't have an inner life with Jesus. So the story goes in Acts 19 that they watched Paul driving out demons, and they would say then to people, hey, in the name of Jesus, whom Paul preaches, I command you to come out. And they would start casting out demons. But one day an evil spirit answered them and said, Jesus I know and Paul I know, but who are you? And then that evil spirit jumped on these 7 sons of Sceva and gave them a beating, and they ran out of the house bleeding. But the point is this: they were trying to exercise an external life in God, but they didn't have the inner life that corresponded with it. And as a result, it was a disaster. And again, Jewish exorcists were popular in ancient times. It was a way to grow a ministry and etc. But think about that, the long-term implications. They say, Jesus I know and Paul I know, but who are you? The demon said. They did not have the inner life with God and with themselves to be doing that kind of external ministry. It's what happens today so often. Think about what would have happened in the church over 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years if those 7 sons of Sceva had gotten into leadership. God didn't stop it in Acts chapter 19. What a mess it would have been. Because Jesus is not a commodity to be seized and marketed. Jesus is not a miraculous power that we basically bring into our churches and ministries to grow them. We're not CEOs of secular organizations. We're different. We're not leading nonprofits or a mission wherever you may be around the world right now, like secular organizations. Christian leadership is distinctly different. The world may be from the external out, and then you work kind of towards the inside. Christian leadership is from the inside out. That's why Paul in 1 Timothy 3 says, if you desire to be an overseer, to be a leader, he goes, that's a great thing. It's a beautiful thing. It's a noble thing. But then he gives requirements of an inner life that's deeply changed, and gives all these qualities like being above reproach and sober-minded, etc. The requirements. And so my journey over the last decades has been, yes, revelation. I got it as I got into emotionally healthy discipleship almost 3 decades ago, that, it's from the inside out, not the outside in. but it is only deepened. It is just deepened on levels that I never imagined here 3 decades later. It really is the shift the world is waiting for, you and me and others leading from a deep inner life with God, and that's where we put our attention. When I wrote this book, The Emotionally Healthy Leader, about 9 years ago, I was searching for an illustration that would capture why the inner life is first, out of which flows the outer life. And I came up with this image of a skyscraper from Manhattan, in New York City. When they built skyscrapers in Manhattan, they had to get these machines that would drive steel beams, or pilings they're called, into the granite, the rock, which makes up Manhattan Island. And so they would dig these deep, long poles or pilings into the rock over quite a long period of time. And the higher the building was going to go, the deeper the pilings had to go into the rock. And I had a friend who was a construction engineer who worked on skyscrapers and told me about how sometimes they didn't do the pilings or the steel beams properly into the granite. They went too fast and they started building up. And as a result, the building began to lean, the windows couldn't open, there were cracks in the walls, and they had to either lift the skyscraper and then put the pilings in anew, or tear the skyscraper down completely and do it all over again, putting the beams deep into the rock first before they built up. Well, in the same way, there are inner life issues that need to be built into our life from which we build an external ministry. And so I had four in the Emotionally Healthy Leader book. I identified 4 key inner life issues that had to be in order in our lives if we're going to build up and wide for God. And my observation, this is pure observation over decades, was that these are the 4 issues that caused leaders to not make it long term, to either to crash or burn out, but not thrive over 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And here were the 4 inner life issues. It was face your shadow, lead out of your marriage or singleness, slow down for loving union with Jesus, and practice Sabbath delight. That these 4 inner life issues inform the building up of a skyscraper or our ministries for God. Then the 4 major tasks of leadership going up, which was the second half of the book, is planning and decision making. In other words, we don't just do opening prayer and seize opportunities to fulfill the Great Commission. It flows out of a deep inner life with God, how we do planning, how we do decision making. The next big segment is culture and team building. We just don't ignore elephants in the room to get the job done speedily. We actually see those as elephants in the room or problems as discipleship making moments. How do we do power and wise boundaries? We actually don't ignore challenges like dual relationships. We talk about power and how it's exercised and how it's used in a servant way, in a humble way, versus often what can happen if we're unaware of our shadow, for example, it becomes manipulative. And then finally, we talk about the outer task of endings and new beginnings. And so we don't go into transitions, as we talked about in the last podcast, seeing endings as failures, or I'm a loser, or I postpone them somehow. But rather, no, God, the whole Christian leadership journey is one of endings, waiting, and then letting God birth new beginnings out of us. And so when writing that book, The Emotionally Healthy Leader, I developed 8 charts for these 8 chapters, the inner life and the outer life. And I contrasted typical leadership with what I called emotionally healthy leadership, or leading from the inside out, not the outside in, as I was trained. And so I developed these 8 charts that had standard leadership or typical leadership with emotionally healthy leadership, side by side on each of these 8 topics, whether it was face your shadow, lead out of your marriage or singleness, slow down for loving union with Jesus, practice Sabbath delight, planning, decision-making, culture and team building, power and wise boundaries, endings and new beginnings. And I have a chart on each one. And it was kind of like the cliff notes of the entire book. But the charts are actually quite amazing. They never made it into the book. They underlie the book, but we actually have just put it into an ebook called Leadership. And I want to invite you to download for free that ebook called Leadership, because it's just a great cliff note version or picture of what does it mean to lead from the inside out, not the outside in, which is the great shift the world is waiting for from us. So just go to emotionallyhealthy.org/leadershift. That's emotionallyhealthy.org/leadershift. That's SHIFT, leadershift. Check it out. You will be so glad you did. It's really, I just was reviewing it myself. I said, this was tremendous. And I'm so glad our team has now put it into a free ebook for you to get started on your journey. So this massive leadership shift inside out, again, we're trying to help you. I don't know where you are in your journey. I don't want to overwhelm you because it's such a massive shift. And we want to make nice on-ramps. So that's why we have ebooks to download and books to read like The Emotionally Healthy Leader and a course like the Emotionally Healthy Spirituality or Emotionally Healthy Relationship course or the School for Pastors and Leaders. But it's a culture change. But the key of everything is you. It's me. It's we can only give away who we actually are. And so we have to get to a place, and the best image I know of that place, we've got to get to a place that I'm going to simply call a desert place, a place of solitude where we meet God in our inner lives, out of which we flow into our outer lives. That's the great leadership. So think about it for a minute with me. Let's think about Scripture and the great men and women of Scripture. Think about people like Moses, 40 years in the desert, and people like Elijah. His whole ministry was in the desert. Then he would come out and prophesy. Think of Jeremiah in exile in the desert, and then in Babylon. Think of John the Baptist. He lived his whole life in the desert. Think of Jesus, spent 40 days in the desert, and constantly going out into deserts to get away from people, to be alone, to let his inner life be formed by the Father and get aligned with the Father. Think of the 12 disciples who left everything to be with Jesus. Think of Paul, who spent 3 years in the Arabian desert, according to Galatians. And then we have the desert fathers and mothers who in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, who were living in a time as Christianity became popular in the empire, realized not just the empire was pagan, but the church had become very worldly itself. And they began to flee to the desert in large numbers. And it was actually quite extraordinary. They became known as the Desert Fathers and Mothers, and started with a guy named Anthony in 270 AD. But they saw, as Thomas Merton wrote, they saw pagan society as a shipwreck from which every person had to swim for their lives to get to God, and to let themselves drift along in this ocean of the values of the world, which had then infiltrated the church so much, especially as the emperor became Christian. To go along with the waves of the culture that were also in the church was simply seen by them as a disaster. And so they fled to the deserts, and a great revival broke out in the 3rd and 4th centuries. In fact, there's one community led by a fellow named Pachomius in the deserts of Egypt that is said to have had 10,000 monks and 20,000 nuns. They say it was a glimpse of heaven on earth, and that there were so many people that had fled to the desert. It was almost like the desert was becoming the cities of Alexandria and others. But they made the human heart their text. In other words, they were so concerned about their inner lives with God because they knew that was the only way they could offer a gift to the world. And so in the same way, I love the image of the desert, because we too need to make a radical decision. Listen, I live in New York, okay? We got lots of people here, but we've got to make a radical decision in Western culture that we are going to prioritize our inner life with God, out of which we do external work or ministry for God. And so there's nothing in Western culture that supports this. There's nothing in church culture that supports this, because we're on like a crack, like an adrenaline of doing and task, and we can't stop. It's like it's in our bones. But we somehow need to make a drastic break from our present habits, the way we're functioning. And it's stopping an addiction, not to drugs, but to doing and task that we lead not from the outside in. Again, growing in all of our external competencies, which is not a bad thing, but we actually lead from the inside out. Whoa. And so we become spiritual mothers and spiritual fathers. That's what the world needs. That's what the church needs. Now, let me share two stories with you from the first is from the 12th century, and the second is from the 4th century. And I just love these stories because they kind of give us a glimpse of what I'm talking about here. The first comes from a guy named Bernard of Clairvaux. He was an abbot in France in the 12th century. He had enormous energy. In fact, he so worked hard to restore corrupt monasteries in Europe at that time that were filled with worldliness. And he established 300 monasteries in his life. I mean, that's a lot by the time of his death in 1153. But one of his monks, at some point that he had trained, became the Pope. And so he wrote this Pope, he was called Eugene III, a series of letters. And he basically said to him, you're carrying now a massive external responsibility. You're leading the church in the Western world. But he was very concerned that this fellow, Eugene III, his inner life was not sufficient to cope with the demands that were now on him. It was like the skyscraper. He had a big skyscraper going, but his inner life, his pilings were not strong enough for them. And so he's grieving for him because now he has so many demands on him, just like you do, just like I do. And so he warns him against being engaged in too much activity before his inner life has ripened and grown. And so he calls him not to the sin of sloth. He considered sloth or laziness an unwillingness to engage in silence and solitude. It's easier to be busy than to actually tend to your inner life. He called it sloth. It was a fascinating definition. So he writes them this. He goes, remove yourself from the demands all around you, lest you get distracted and get a hard heart. Because if you're not terrified by the thought of that happening, that is getting a hard heart, you are already lost. And so he calls him to readjust his life. And that's the invitation to us today. The massive leadership shift is to readjust your life. And I'll talk about that as we close here. Your whole life, so that your exterior doing for God is flowing out of a deep interior life with him. The second story comes from the 4th century. It's a famous one by a guy named Theodore of Fermi. He was a desert father. And he was in a desert, seeking God's face. Now, one of the great dynamics of men and women who went to the desert in large numbers in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, all the leaders of the church came in the first 1,500 years out of basically the monastery, the desert, because these were the men and women with a deep spirituality, with a deep inner life with God. And so in the desert, they were constantly going out to these men and women and trying to pull them back in the church to exercise public leadership. So they wanted Theodore to come back to the city and be like a priest, be a leader in the church. And he said, okay. They came to him and he said, let me go pray to the God to see if I ought to make a decision to go with you. And so he prays to God and he says, Lord, if it's your will that I should go, make me sure of it. And then a pillar of fire appears, stretching from earth to heaven. And a voice speaks out of that pillar of fire saying this, if you can become like this pillar of fire, go and be a deacon, or go and be a leader. Wow. But he realizes I'm not a pillar of fire. And so he realized I need to become fire from the inside first. And so he doesn't go, not yet, because he recognizes to claim that level of spiritual authority is a destiny, is a calling that requires a deep inner life. And it requires a life of prayer and watchfulness that has to be tended to. I just love the two stories because, again, my formation, my development, just like I'm sure yours has been, because I'm a product of Western church culture, has been primarily, the weight has been on the external doing of the competencies of leadership and ministry. But it's really not first. That's actually second. The massive shift we need is leading from the inside out and tending to our inner lives. Try to imagine with me, you being a person that you're not feeling pressure. You don't feel any pressure of having too much to do in too little time because you've got a great sense of discerning of what God's asking you to do and what God's asking you not to do. You're not being driven or pulled by self-promotion or what people think of you. You're free from people's praise. You're free from people's criticism. It doesn't really matter to you at this point. Imagine yourself without stress, without anxiety, without the tightness of your body because you got so much to do in too little time. Imagine yourself not concerned at all about what other people think. I mean, you want to love people, not being rude, but you're just free from their praise or criticism. Try to imagine yourself without fear about the future, because you know that Jesus is in the boat. It may seem like he's asleep, but he's the Lord of the storm, and you're okay, even though there may be lots of anxiety around you. Imagine yourself not rushing at all, but just doing one thing at a time and savoring and enjoying the day. Try to imagine yourself not easily offended or defensive. And when someone may bring a critique to you, you're like, tell me more about that. Imagine yourself not preoccupied and distracted so often, where you're maybe in a place, but you're thinking about something else. Imagine yourself not being judgmental. I mean, I like one desert father saying, it goes like this: a person may be praying, but if in their heart they're condemning other people, they are just babbling ceaselessly. Great truth. But imagine you're not judgmental toward anybody. You're just loving, like God is love. Imagine not being threatened by anybody else's success around you, or imagine being a person who listens way more than you talk, like a servant going to their master doesn't talk a lot. They're listening for orders. You're just listening a lot more. And imagine just being a person who listens to God, who's discerning, a person of discernment. One of the great desert father saying goes like this: a person of discernment who's like walking and hearing God is like a woodsman who can fell a tree with one word. Think about that. Imagine being a person of discernment who, like a woodsman, can fell a tree with one word. Wow. So let me invite you into the great leader shift the world is waiting for. And that is leading and living from the inside out. Listen, if you're a parent today, that's what your kids need. If you're married, that's what your spouse needs. If you're single, that's what your friends need from you. And if you're leading any kind of ministry anywhere, that's what the people you serve need to shift from you, that you're leading from a deep inner life with God to the outside. So adjust your job description, whatever your job may be. You may be in the marketplace, that your number one job is basically to be with Jesus, to cultivate a deep inner life with him. Integrate silence, integrate solitude as part of your job. It's part of your role. It's part of life, because without solitude and silence, as was said by Henry Nouwen years earlier, that you can't even grow spiritually. Discover the rhythms at a daily office and begin to have pauses throughout the day, morning, midday, evening, of just stopping and being with Jesus, so that when you're active, you're remembering him all through the day. Begin practicing Sabbath delight, a 24-hour period where you stop all work and you stop, you rest, you delight in God and all of his gifts. You contemplate his glory. You let go of you running the world, and you got it. He's on the throne, and you begin to build Sabbath rest into your weeks, into your quarters, into your years. And then you want to be crafting a rule of life of saying, how am I balancing all my life so that Jesus' love is in the center, and my life is one of receiving God's love and then giving it out to the world around me. So listen, this may seem a bit overwhelming. It's large. This is a life journey. I'm in it every day, including today. And it's a long journey that is leading and living from the inside out, not the outside in. So please get started with us. I want to invite you in wherever you are in that journey. And so let me encourage you again, download this free ebook with these 8 charts. And it's a nice getting started way to begin to contrast leading from the inside out and leading from the outside in. Standard Christian leadership, or typical, versus, I'm going to call it, emotionally healthy Christian leadership. And the ebook is called Leader Shift. Just go to emotionallyhealthy.org/leadershift, and you get that for you, and it's free. There's a radically different way to do life in God. There's a different way to do planning and decision-making, different way to build healthy cultures and teams, a different way to exercise the power God's given us and set healthy boundaries. There's a different way to do transitions, endings, and new beginnings. But it begins with you. It begins with me. It begins with us leading from the inside out. It really is the massive shift the world is waiting for. So I bless you. I pray for you. I commit you to the hands of God, that he may fill you with vision for this kind of a shift in your life, and that you will get on this journey by his grace, and you will taste something so good from him that it will pull you ahead, pull you forward into the unique destiny God has for you, that your life may be a gift to the world, to the church, to those who surround you day by day. Blessings, everybody. So good to be with you. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.